Download our complimentary guidebooks, checklists, and other useful financial resources at savantwealth.com/guides.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. We're going to spend about the next half hour discussing the most common retirement and planning mistakes that we see faculty make, given recent trends and changes. I can see we have quite a few people in the live presentation today, so thank you to everyone who's joining us. I also want to let those joining us know that if you have questions that you'd like to ask, you can submit at any time during the discussion today by using the Q&A box, and we'll respond directly to you. We'll also have an offer for our listeners at the end of the presentation today for a complimentary financial analysis, so please make sure to listen for that. I thought a little background on our team before we get started would be helpful. At Savant, we are a comprehensive fee-only fiduciary that is focused on helping our clients achieve their ideal financial futures. Our university planning team has specifically been helping university faculty and their families achieve their financial goals for over the past 25 years. So we have a good sense of what typical issues we see faculty and their families face as they approach retirement. We have clients at over 50 different research campuses across the country, and we are familiar with different retirement vendors and benefits plans, as well as typical gaps that we see in planning. I'm joined today by my colleague, John Clarke.
Good afternoon, James.
Good afternoon, John. John and I are both certified financial planners and member owners here at Savant. John has been advising university professionals across the country for the past 6 years, and I have been for the past 14 years. Our team has completed thousands of financial assessments, and we work with over 400 faculty and their families on an ongoing basis at dozens of research universities across the country. And we spend a lot of time with faculty when they're first introduced to our team, taking time to understand their goals and what gaps might exist from a planning perspective. John, why don't you share with us what we'll be covering today during the webinar?
Yeah, absolutely. So as James mentioned, we spend quite a bit of time learning about faculty members' financial goals when they're starting to think a little bit more about putting together a plan. The nice thing about working with one type of client is we get a really good sense of common pain points for those individuals as they're approaching retirement. So it's a lot easier for us to develop a holistic financial picture. Today, during the next half hour, we will look to provide you with some planning ideas that are actionable and have been relevant to a lot of the faculty that we serve. We will also share a starting point at the end of our session that a lot of professors have utilized as a blueprint for their own planning as they begin to put together a financial plan for their families. We'll also begin by highlighting a few recent tax law changes and some planning opportunities that exist given those changes, and discuss the changing investment environment and what you should be thinking about with the increase in interest rates. We wanted to cover these topics today because the answers to some of the planning questions we've been receiving on the tax and investment side have evolved quite a bit over the past several years.
John, thanks for walking us through the agenda for today. Why don't we get started by jumping into our first topic, something that almost everyone certainly enjoys discussing, taxes. But seriously, John, that we've seen a number of major tax law changes the past several years and some additional changes that are very likely to be coming in the near future. What should I be thinking about in terms of tax planning if I'm a professor?
Thanks. Yeah, obviously taxes are something that weigh on a lot of professors' minds, especially if they're approaching retirement. There are really 3 areas that I think each professor and their family should consider when they're thinking about their tax situation to ensure that they're not making any mistakes. They should start by looking at the big picture tax environment to understand what tax law changes have impacted them or will impact them in their future. They should look at their specific situation to identify some strategies that will assist in optimizing their situation. And finally, I would say, fully understand what supplemental plans that your university offers to help minimize what they're paying in taxes today and then possibly into the future.
John, that's a good way to think about taxes. And as I mentioned, there have been some changes at a high level. So would you mind starting with the big picture? Can you share with us some of the recent changes that we've seen and how that might impact professors' tax planning decisions?
Sure, James. Yeah, I think Probably the most appropriate place to start would be the sunsetting of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or TCJA for short. That was initially passed back in 2017. So currently, beginning in January 1st of 2026, that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is scheduled to sunset. And at that point, we would revert back to the previous tax code we were under, brackets back in 2017. So we're less than 2 years away potentially from some pretty significant shifts in income tax rates.
And how would that impact specifically a professor if we were to go back to the brackets from 2017?
Yeah, so I guess we'll start with maybe the not so good news. Tax rates for a lot of professors will be higher for marginal income tax rates, particularly for married couples filing jointly. As you can see in the brackets shown here, if we look at the yellow on the left-hand side, which represents the 2024 bracket, we can see that the current rate is relatively low and wide. That's the 24% bracket, and that extends all the way up to $383,900. So for a lot of couples that are higher income earners, a significant amount of their income is being taxed at that 24% rate. If we revert back to those previous marginal rates, we could see the marginal rates on a much steeper schedule, and couples hitting the upper band of the current 24% bracket would actually be well into the 33% bracket.
That's a really significant change. So a lot of cases, those individuals would be looking at like a 9% adjustment up on their highest marginal rate. What strategies should a professor be thinking about if they were to find themselves in that situation that you're describing?
Yeah, obviously things are subject to change, and I might earmark or write down that date. And everybody's financial situation is a little bit different. But if you're on the cusp of retirement, now would be a really good time to start taking maybe some larger distributions from your nest egg to fill up that bracket, depending on expectations for future income levels. Another potential strategy to investigate would be a Roth conversion, where you would take a portion of your pre-tax accounts, like your 403B or a traditional IRA, and convert a portion or all of that into a Roth account. In this scenario, you really want to weigh a lot of different factors. You could even be impacting your Medicare premiums if you do that. So you really want to be thoughtful. But the bottom line is this could be a great way to pay taxes today, to have a portion of your portfolio grow entirely tax-free in the future. And even just making Roth contributions, if your 403B plan allows for that, can be a great way to build more tax balance. Many professors are unaware that there's no income limit that applies to Roth money going into a 403B. So if your income exceeds the limitations allowed for Roth IRAs, the next couple of years, it just could be really crucial to explore ways to continue to shape your nest egg in a tax efficient way.
Yeah, John, I think that's a really good suggestion. And for anyone retiring soon, especially if they had a larger salary through the university and anticipate their actual spending needs being less in retirement, this could be a good strategy to explore. Shifting gears a little bit, we talked about anticipated changes that are upcoming. Do you think we should touch on anything else from a tax law perspective?
Yeah, I think we should probably, look at, if we're looking now a couple years into effect of the Secure Act, which was passed in 2019, and then recently the Secure Act 2.0, we are still seeing and will continue to see adjustments around income tax planning based on those law changes. I think the biggest evolution, if you want to call it that, is required minimum distributions and how to tax plan effectively for those distributions in retirement. If we look back to the original Secure Act, you'd see your required minimum distribution age, which is the portion of pre-tax assets that the IRS requires you to distribute beginning at age 70 and a half, when you're no longer an active employee. The initial Secure Act actually bumped that age up to 72. Now we're at age 73. By 2033, the first time you'll be required to distribute from those pre-tax accounts. We're looking all the way out to age 75. And while many university professionals enjoy really long careers, I guess what I'm trying to illustrate here is this opens up more flexibility on when you want to start taking those distributions from accounts. So for a lot of Individuals with larger 403B or 457B balances, those distributions could be fairly significant. Roth accounts are now exempt from RMDs beginning this year. So I guess, that also ties in nicely with our conversation around tax balance and planning today ahead of that RMD age.
Yeah, so it sounds just like a ton of flexibility in when you have to begin your RMDs, and also give you some opportunity to think through how to reduce maybe future distributions. Any other opportunities that are opened up by the increase in RMD age?
Yeah, I guess, James, the one thing I forgot to mention would be if you're charitably inclined, qualified charitable distributions are really a great tax efficient way to make your gifts. If you're at that RMD age historically, the maximum you can give is $100,000. This gifting strategy used to be tied to the RMD age, but you can still see that you can make gifts at age 70 and a half ahead of the now later RMD age. So that's an opportunity that didn't exist before.
That's a really good point, John. Would you mind, for those of us listening, if we don't know what a QCD is or a qualified charitable distribution, can you explain how those work?
Yeah, thank you, James. QCDs are gifts that come directly from pre-tax accounts, where the income tax burden on the portion of your gift is made entirely tax-free. So think about it, the magnitude of your gift is just quite a bit larger. So if you have significant pre-tax accounts and you want to make charitable gifts, this strategy can often be one of the most effective ways to make that gift. One nuance that's particularly important to understand for these gifts, especially for most of those joining, is you must make those gifts coming from IRA accounts. They cannot be made from 403B or 57B accounts. So logistically, you can see how it could be a little bit difficult for some of our clients to execute these strategies on their own, but it's definitely something we help families out with all the time to achieve their gifting goals.
Thanks for breaking that down for us, John.
Of course, yeah. I think as we talk through these strategies, I'm just trying to highlight how being proactive on a tax planning front can really make a large impact on how to approach your retirement income plan in a strategic fashion. So we've talked about the bigger tax changes and tax planning ideas that I think would be relevant to a lot of those joining on the call. James, when you think about university faculty and their portfolios within their university plans, what are some items to think about in that regard?
Yeah, I would say that one of the biggest challenges that professors face when they get to retirement is transitioning from saving and accumulating assets for maybe 30 years to now having to protect those assets and produce their own income for the next 30 years. Not having a paycheck can be pretty scary. And being a tenured faculty member means basically having a guaranteed monthly income as long as you can work. And you have contributions going into your retirement plans every month. But at some point, your paycheck from the university is going to stop. And you're going to be the one then that's tasked with replicating that income for the rest of your life. And since the Great Recession in 2009, investing in retirement plans and even transitioning into retirement was something that was fairly easily achieved for most faculty. We saw sustained and steady growth in the equity markets, except for a few small hiccups. And fixed income assets have been pretty boring, with interest rates staying very low. So having success either saving for retirement or being retired in the 2010s was, by historical measures, somewhat easy from a portfolio investment standpoint. But we saw all of that pretty much change in 2020 with COVID. And since then, we've seen pretty dramatic swings in the equity market, including double-digit losses and gains within the same year, and markets even hitting historical highs. We've also seen inflation remain very high the past few years, causing the Fed to take historical action on interest rates to try to rein that in. And on top of that, we're dealing with increased global conflict and political polarization. So this means that staying on track with your retirement savings and being able to produce steady retirement income is likely going to be much more challenging the next 10 years than it has been the last 10 years.
Yeah, you're right, James. We've just seen a ton of changes since 2020, which you've highlighted really well. Inflation and interest rates is something that has caused a lot of changes for everyone, especially with bond investments. How is that specifically impacting retirement plans?
Yeah, well, everyone thinks of bonds as the safe part of your portfolio, right? And we all know the old rule of thumb that the older you get and the closer to retirement you get, the more bonds you're supposed to have in your portfolio. And it's true that, historically bonds have offered good stability and diversification from stocks, but they're definitely not without their own risks. We saw this in 2022 when bonds had their worst annual return in about 40 years. This was caused primarily by rising interest rates with the Fed's response to inflation. And we haven't seen a rising interest rate environment for a few decades now. So this caught a lot of people off guard, especially those nearing retirement who were starting to rely on their bonds for safety. So it's important to remember that one of the biggest risks associated with bonds is interest rate risks. So bonds and especially bond funds have a very direct inverse relationship with interest rate changes. So when rates go up, like we've seen the last year or so, existing bond values tend to go down.
Yeah, I think you've explained that relationship well. So what are a couple of action steps that a university professional could take to reduce their interest rate risk while still getting the stability that they crave in their portfolios?
Yeah, I think a great first step would be to take advantage of all of the tools that are in your university retirement plans and maybe look beyond using just bonds. So there are some really great choices for fixed income investments in most university retirement plans that can offer stability and safety that people are looking for with bonds, but they come without that inverse relationship and interest rate risk. And these are typically referred to as stable value funds. TIAA, for example, has a fund called TIAA Traditional, which is a guaranteed fixed account. Other custodians have stable value or fixed funds as well, but TIAA Traditional is probably the most widely used within the university setting. And these types of funds are a great option to consider adding to the fixed income portion of your portfolio because they don't have interest rate risk like bonds do. TI Traditional guarantees the balance of that fund as well. So if we see a year where both stocks and bonds do poorly, like we did in 2022, the portion of your assets in that fund will not lose any value. It's not FDIC insured, but it is backed by one of the strongest insurance companies in the country. And we do recognize that currently bonds are actually positioned to do quite well if interest rates do start to go down, which we're hoping they will at some point soon. But now is a great time to revisit the use of stable value funds in your portfolio, as many of these funds have dramatically increased the interest rates that they are paying now compared to just a couple of years ago. But it isn't very, very important that you speak with a custodian or a financial advisor before investing a large amount of new assets into these funds because there can be some liquidity restrictions that you need to be aware of in the future when you go to take your money back out of them.
Yeah, that's a good point, James. I think you've done a really nice job kind of weighing some of the pros and cons and consider relating to stable value products. Can you just touch a bit more on process and what to think about more broadly in that regard?
Yeah, well, I think, I've found like with most things in life, efficiently managing your retirement savings account starts with having a well-defined and purposeful and disciplined process. Success is going to be better achieved with following a process based on a foundation of principle than it is going to be by looking for shortcuts or chasing trends. And I'm going to walk through some of the basic principles and practices that our process for managing university retirement plan assets is built on. At Savant, we use a process called evidence-based investing to help build efficient portfolios that achieve very good risk-adjusted returns.
I agree. I think having a disciplined process, especially when it comes to portfolio construction, is extremely important. We often hear, though, from faculty that they think the stock and bond market is just made up of random returns and events, and it's just better to kind of, invest in low-cost index funds and then forget about it. How would you kind of speak to that a little bit more, James?
Yeah, I think it's true that trying to outperform a specific market or index, or even trying to time the market, is almost always unsuccessful. But there are some evidence-based principles of diversification and risk efficiency that can help investors get a better risk-adjusted return over long periods of time. And the most important aspect of an efficient portfolio is having a way to measure and to adjust your risk. This is going to be the foundation of how you'll manage your portfolio and the blueprint for how the specifics of your plan is built. And we refer to this as your asset allocation model. So at a high level, this means how much of your portfolio is in different types of investments, such as stocks and bonds. A portfolio that's 80% in stocks and 20% in bonds is going to act and perform very differently than one that's 20% in stocks and 80% in bonds. So it's extremely important to get this right, because this is not only going to be the main driver of how your investments perform, but it's also going to be the primary factor of if you're going to be able to sleep at night or not during retirement based on your comfort level with risk. The best way to start this process is to really find the right asset allocation model that's going to allow you to achieve your long-term growth goals so that your money lasts as long as you need it to, but one that also handles short-term risk and volatility in a way that doesn't make you uncomfortable. And once we have a model identified at a high level, then we need to dig a little bit deeper and diversify within the major asset classes. So if your portfolio is 60% in stocks, for example, what type of stocks you're exposed to can make a big difference in the risk level and the efficiency of your portfolio. As an example, a portfolio that has too much exposure to international or small cap stocks might have way too much volatility and risk, whereas a portfolio that has too much exposure to large US value companies might underperform over long periods of time. And John, what we found is that over long periods of time, adding additional equity and fixed income asset classes has actually shown to decrease risk and improve efficiency in a portfolio compared to non-diversified, just basic stock and bond portfolios.
Yeah, I think you've done a good job just laying the foundation on how to diversify amongst different types of stocks and bonds and why it's important. What asset classes, not stocks and bonds are all, can you share, and just thinking more about kind of the alternative space and how that might help in reducing risk?
Yeah, that's right, John. So we already talked about the potential benefits of using stable value funds as an alternative to bonds on the fixed income side of your portfolio. But at a broader level, adding alternatives as its own asset allocation to a portfolio can reduce the standard deviation, which is a good way to measure risk, and actually increase return over time. So this is another layer of evidence-based investing that can go a long way to helping to preserve your assets and be better positioned to produce income during retirement.
I think you've really illustrated the value of diversification and even adding in things like alternatives or stable value products to your portfolio. Can you just share what else a professor could do to, I guess, better manage their retirement plan?
Yeah, so once you have that appropriate asset allocation model in place, there's a few other tools that you can use to efficiently manage that portfolio going forward. One that we like to implement is something we call a unified portfolio approach. And this is the practice of viewing all of your different accounts that you have as part of a bigger universal asset allocation model. So for example, let's say you have two 403B plans from your current university. You maybe have a private IRA, an after-tax brokerage account. It could be much more efficient to view those separate accounts as pieces that make up the larger investment plan instead of just four unique individual models that are just working in isolation. Sometimes it makes sense to consolidate accounts at one custodian to simplify things, but that's not always possible, and it's not always in your best interest. Sometimes, for example, there's restrictions on your current employer's retirement plans. Plus, if you're working, you're still contributing to those plans each month. IRAs have different RMD rules if you worked past right now age 73, and you can't mix pre-tax retirement assets with after-tax investments in a brokerage account. Sometimes there's unique or grandfathered rules within certain plans, like exemption from state income taxes when you take a distribution, or unique rates that are paid on the guaranteed TIAA Traditional account that we mentioned. So instead of just rushing to consolidate all of your assets at one location, it can be more beneficial for you to understand the unique aspects of your different accounts and then manage them towards a common big picture goal. And this approach allows us to take advantage of the different unique strengths at the different custodians that you have access to, and also be more efficient with things like taxes.
Yeah. I guess, James, what's the best way to keep it all on track, given the variables you outlined?
Yeah, so after we have that asset allocation model, and then we have a plan to manage the accounts as a unified portfolio in place, really that the next step is to keep it on track, like you mentioned. And this process is commonly called rebalancing. And it sounds and is, extremely easy in principle, but it's also one of the most overlooked aspects and common mistakes that we see professors make in managing their retirement plans.
Yeah. Can you share with those in attendance just how rebalancing your portfolio can be effective and how it's not what people often refer to as market timing?
Yeah, John. So it's true that trying to time the market is usually going to hurt your returns. That's what the data shows us. But rebalancing is not market timing. Rebalancing is a reaction to what's already happened. So we let the market do what it's going to do, and then we readjust to keep your risk level the same going forward. Let's say, for example, that you start out the beginning of the year with a 60-40 asset allocation model in your portfolio. And during that year, stocks do extremely well, while bonds are relatively flat in performance. At the end of the year, you now have maybe like a 70-30 asset allocation instead of that targeted 60-40 like we set the year out with. And if we fast forward from there to the following year, let's say that stocks don't do as well and they end up being down by 10%, while bonds that next year do a little bit better and they're up by 5%. If you did not rebalance at the end of that first year, your portfolio would perform significantly worse that second year. So 70% of your portfolio would now have gone down by 10% instead of only 60% of it. And only 30% of your portfolio would have gone up by 5%. So rebalancing your portfolio is a very important way to control risk over time by systematically selling when the market gets too high to lock in gains and reduce risk, and then buying when the market's low to help increase returns over time.
Yeah, you've done a really nice job just illustrating how proper diversification, adding alternatives, talking about the unified portfolio approach, and then finally rebalancing can protect your retirement nest egg. Is there anything else our attendees should be thinking about with their investments as they approach retirement?
Yeah, I mean, there's one more big thing, John, and that's to coordinate your investment plan with your retirement income production plan. So after all, the main purpose of these assets is to fund your retirement income and other financial goals you have as well. So there needs to be careful coordination between the management of the portfolio with the distribution of income. And we also want to be efficient with one of your biggest expenses in retirement that you already walked us through, which is taxes. And you already pointed out, John, planning for things like RMDs and being efficient with taxes in your after-tax account can go a long ways towards your total return. It's oftentimes easier to save 5% or more with careful tax planning than it is to get an extra 1% risk-adjusted return in your portfolio.
Thanks, James. I think you've given those viewing today a really nice sense that it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all approach. We appreciate all those in attendance today during our session. We hope that you found our discussion relating to the recent tax and investment landscape changes to be helpful. If you're looking to take another proactive step, for anyone joining us today, if you happen to be even listening to this recording in the future, we're going to be offering a complimentary financial analysis to give you a sense of if you're on track to meet your goals in retirement. This process is an opportunity to have your specific financial situation reviewed by us. The assessment is very comprehensive in nature, really gives faculty members a tremendous opportunity to assess where they are and offer some specific recommendations to better reach their retirement goals. And as you can see from the sample that we're highlighting on the screen, this certainly isn't cookie cutter. We're providing detailed retirement income projections, assessing the current state of risk in your portfolio, and then also looking for opportunities to put some foundational pieces in place relating to the estate plan. As highlighted on today's call, we'll also look for proactive tax planning opportunities for you. If you have interest in completing this analysis or just kind of want to learn a little bit more about it, And if you have questions about engaging in it, there will be a survey that comes out immediately following the webinar where you can message us and our team will respond directly to you.
Thanks, John. For all of those that are still on the call, we want to just take a couple moments here and open up the webinar to more of a conversation. So we'll welcome answering a few questions. We don't have a lot of time, so we'll answer just a few questions today. If you submitted a question that we don't answer, we will reach out to you directly to try to get that answered for you soon. John, why don't you go ahead and take the first question today?
Yeah, certainly. Okay, so our first question, I didn't understand the part about Roth contributions and contributing money into a 403B plan. Can you please expand upon what you meant by that? I thought I made too much money to contribute to a Roth IRA. Absolutely, I think I understand what this attendee is asking. So this is actually a pretty common stumbling block for many individuals. So to provide, I guess, some further context, the Roth IRA income limits for single tax filers is $161,000, and then for married couples filing jointly, it's $240,000. These limits don't apply if you're making Roth contributions into a 403B plan. So if your plan allows for those types of contributions, that's the one, I guess, additional piece of information that's important. The plan has to allow for it. But oftentimes we see plans that allow for Roth contributions within the supplemental 403B, and this can be a really good way to build tax balance over time, depending on your tax situation. James, how about you take the next one?
Yeah, so next question says, when is a good time for a university faculty member to do a deep dive review of their retirement plan? So I would encourage everyone to always be doing financial planning. There's really no bad time to do that. Even, when you're beginning your career, mid-career, you always want to make sure you're on track. But I would say that as you get close to retirement, it does take some time depending on what your goals are and what course correcting needs to be done to help you hit your goals. It can often take a little bit of time to implement those planning suggestions and actually see some results. So ideally, if you're 5 years out from retirement, it's good to have a pretty serious comprehensive plan in place that's going to not only look at your retirement plans and your overall plan and strategy for managing that portfolio, but really starting to dive deep into the mechanics of how you're going to produce an income in retirement. How are you going to time those distributions? You talked a lot, John, about some tax planning opportunities, so really understanding that, but also incorporating things like Social Security claiming, and how do you integrate with Medicare? Do you use the university retiree health plan? Do you get a private Medicare plan? And then, any other goals that are relevant for you and your family really need to be ironed out. So 5 years is a great time frame to do that. If you're within 2 years and you haven't done that, I would say there's quite a bit of urgency there to really do a review and see where you're at with things. The offer that you mentioned, John's a great way to do that. So if you're in that situation, feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to talk with you about that. So, and I'll go ahead and I'll do the final question for today as well. So it says, you mentioned income tax rates going up if the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is allowed to sunset. Will anything happen to estate taxes as part of that as well? That's actually a really good question. So there's a lot of attention right now on income tax changes that will happen if the TCJA is allowed to sunset in 2026. But part of that provision as well will impact individual federal estate tax exemption limits. So right now, the exemption limits at the federal level are very generous. They're around $13 million per individual. So if you're a married couple, you can double that. You can combine your exemptions together. So not very many people need to worry about federal estate taxes at this point in time, but The way that that's written is if it sunsets in 2026, then we're going to go back to the exemption rates that we had in 2017, which was around 5.5 million at that time. And it will be indexed for inflation, is my understanding. So it'll be slightly higher than that going forward, but a figure around half of what it currently is. Also very important to understand if where you're living, there might be state, either state estate taxes or inheritance taxes that could supersede the federal exemptions as well. But very good question. That is something that could have a big change as well in 2026. So make sure you keep an eye on that. So.
Great. Well, I guess we're going to wrap up here, but we want to thank everyone that joined us today for our discussion. I would encourage all of you to check out other helpful information that we have on savantwealth.com. And then you also may want to check out the link to our university division website. Thanks so much and have a great day.
If you enjoyed this webinar, visit savantwealth.com/guides and download our complimentary guidebooks, checklists, and other useful financial resources.